Right, let's start. I will, at the end of this lecture, talk to you briefly about the midterm, which I know you're all looking forward to taking on Thursday. I'm going to go over one of the questions with you, if we have enough time at the end of this class. And this is also a final reminder that those of you who want to do the research paper instead of taking the final exam at the end of the semester has to declare an interest by the time of the midterm. So what you have to do is email either Melissa or Gillian and let them know that you are interested in doing so. Okay? Okay, so this is a lecture about the First World War, the Great War. And it's great not in the heroic sense, but great in the sense of its extraordinary scale and impact. It was a war that dramatized an unprecedented degree of violence, of slaughter, and had very important consequences for economic, political, social, and cultural life. It was a war that was truly transformative for the people who experienced it. It shaped the lives of several generations, for whom the world was never quite the same again, either those who fought in the war or for those who did not. My grandfather, Jim Larkin, that you see behind me, was one of the men who fought in that dreadful war, and this lecture is dedicated to him, and I'll give you something of his personal experience of the war later on. But today, I think we have to do more than simply do justice to the human experience of the war. What I'm also interested in trying to convey to you today was how to explore how transformative that war was, and in particular, whether it represented the end of the liberal order that had been put in place during the 19th century that I've been boring you to tears about all semester so far. Now, for many, well, almost all historians, the First World War is always taken as a key marker of change. Very often, historical studies either begin or end with the First World War. And this was a trend that began very early and began with this very famous satire of the way in which British history was taught in schools called 1066 and all that, written by Sellers and Yeatman, both themselves veterans of the First World War, and both of them concerned to basically ridicule the so-called drums and trumpets style of teaching history in British schools, which tried to show that history was about the forward march and the perfectibility of the British nation and the British people. Their story came to an end with the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, when they said history came to a period. And history comes to a full stop in 1919 for Sellers and Yeatman because it's the moment where Britain becomes a debtor to the United States. And the United States, as they say, becomes the top nation. The Great War since then has been routinely portrayed as heralding the end of a belief in liberal progress and the imperial confidence that often went with it. It's also seen by many people as providing if you like, almost an interruption of time, that it represented a state of emergency in which the conduct of regular life was temporarily suspended. And it also represents for many people the moment in which the demands of total war, this new totalizing experience of war that required the mobilization of all the powers of the state, led to the decisive end of the central pillars of the liberal order that we have been exploring this semester. Some have even suggested that the Great War is the beginning of a new type of relationship between the state and its subjects and citizens. So whatever approach one takes to understanding the role of the First World War, I think there are two essential questions that preoccupy historians that you have to figure out. The first is, did the war in and of itself cause change? Was the war itself generative of a new series of historical processes? Or was it a catalyst that helped accelerate changes that had already been underway since the late 19th century? So, was it a cause or was it a catalyst? And then the third option that you have is whether it didn't really make that much difference at all to anything. That, as I said, there was just a temporary suspension of the normal order of things, and that after the armistice, the liberal order was quickly restored, and liberal England persisted into the 1920s and the 1930s, and some have even suggested down to the 1960s. So let me begin by trying to give you a sense of the way in which you can consider the war to be a continuation of the belief in liberal progress that characterized the late Victorian and Edwardian period, and the continuing belief in the forward march of the British Empire. Now, you'll know from the lecture on Tuesday that militarism in the Edwardian period, in the first decade of the 20th century, was profoundly important. It was this that bred the fascination with the health of Britain's imperial race, the attempts by organizations like the Boy Scouts to make boys potential future men and conquerors of other people. And for many people, the First World War provided an outlet for this militarism. Indeed, some interested in questions of eugenics thought that the war would provide an opportunity for weeding out the more inferior or weaker elements of Britain's racial stock, that Britain would actually be rejuvenated by the experience of war. And others also embraced the Great War as an opportunity to test Britain's military and economic might against the upstarts like Germany. The other important element of this was that Britain portrayed itself, with the outbreak of war, as continuing its mission to advance the cause of liberty and of freedom. The First World War for Britain was about the defense of liberty and the defense of freedom against what it portrayed as German militarism and tyranny. And the greatest example of that, with the outbreak of the war, was the so-called Rape of Belgium. The German invasion of Belgian territory and the treatment of its population at the hands of German soldiers, portrayed here in this striking image of men being shot and women being rounded up. In other words, there was an appeal by the recruiting officers in Britain to appeal to the old elements of Britain's masculine honour, to say to British men, look, it's your duty, it's your conscience to defend the women of this small, defenceless, neutral nation that was Belgium. You are destined to defend the traditions of European constitutional liberties that Britain had projected itself as the defender and saviour of. In short, if you don't stand up to the Germans now, it will be your women and children that will fall prey to the German military very soon. In other words, masculinity and patriotism were very closely combined. And this is important. You have to understand that the British Army in the First World War was, up until January 1916, a volunteer army. People volunteered en masse, 2.5 million men volunteered to go and fight in the carnage of that war. Now, I'm not going to suggest that they went to fight because their women told them that that's what they had to do in order to be men, although you're going to see there's an element of that too. They went because they were gripped with the type of patriotic fervour and the belief in the civilising influence of the British Empire and the importance of constitutional liberties. But it's also true that the alternative to fighting was to be pilloried as an emasculated man, as a coward. And here it's important to recognise that the British suffrage movement, the women's suffrage movement, played a key role in whipping up this patriotic fervour. So, even that most militant wing of the women's suffrage movement, the Women's Social and Political Union, remember, headed up by Christabel and Emmeline Pankhurst, called immediately for the use of universal male conscription. They renamed their newspaper, which had been called the Suffragette, Britannia. And they urged men to do their duty and go fight, and to protect the women and children of the country, as you can see in this striking image. Women, Britain say go. The women of Britain say go. And one of the key elements here was this, the use of women to help recruit men. The Order of the White Feather was set up by actually the leading women anti-suffragist and a leading military commander, in order to go around and hand out white feathers to men who they felt should have been should have volunteered to go and fight. So all of this seems to be a continuation of much of the forms of militarism and patriotism and masculinity that had been the characteristics of the late Victorian and Edwardian period. But we also have to remember that the Great War wasn't simply a European conflagration. It was a global war. It was truly a world war, and it was a world war between imperial powers. It was a war fought not just in Europe, but in Africa, in Eastern Africa, in Northern Africa, in the Middle East. And it was a war fought with troops mobilized across the British Empire. Indian troops, the use of Indian troops, which were absolutely vital to the defence of Britain's imperial interests in Africa, the Middle East, and even on the Western Front. And so too were troops from Australia, Canada, New Zealand. And indeed, outside of Europe, it seemed, outside of the trench warfare of Europe, which very quickly became a mud and a bloodbath, it seemed that the other theatres of war, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa, seemed to keep open the possibility of war as a type of boy's own imperial adventure. Precisely the sort of image of war that had been portrayed in all of those boys' magazines of the late Victorian and Edwardian period. And the most famous example of that is the person you see behind me here, T.E. Lawrence, who played such an important and heroized role in the campaign in Mesopotamia, in what we think of largely as Iraq today. Anyone who's seen that fantastic film, thank you, will get a sense of the way in which Lawrence is made into a heroic figure, riding around the desert on camels and providing a type of guerrilla campaign of endless adventure and movement. But of course, that is a gross caricature. And the campaign around Gallipoli, the British and French attempts to try and capture the Ottoman capital of Constantinople, was a great example of how atypical that idea of an adventurous boy's own adventure, the war in these theatres, were. 44,000 allies died during that campaign, which lasted about 6 months in 1915 through the second half of 1915. A further 100,000 wounded, and those figures were dwarfed by the number of Turkish casualties. Over 87,000 Turkish deaths and 165,000 casualties. So, which is a nice bridge into talking about the experience of war in Europe and the way in which it decisively checked the idea that the war could somehow prove a continuation of the heroic adventures that many had hoped for. The first thing to say about the Great War is, of course, to account for the numbers of people who perished in this conflict. Almost 10 million military deaths, almost 7 million civilian deaths. A total of around 1 million British casualties, including 250,000 colonial troops in that figure. And one of the reasons why casualties were so high during the First World War was because it was the first truly industrial scale war. This was a war that was the consequence of the industrial technologies, not just of the first industrial revolution, but also critically of the second industrial revolution in the second half of the 19th century. It produced a whole new series of technologies of murder that enabled people to be killed far more efficiently and at ever greater distances. So let me just run through some of those. In a way, the most important of them all was the machine gun. The breech loading rifle had basically had a range of around 500 yards in the middle of the 19th century. Compare that to the muskets that had been used in the Napoleonic Wars in the late 18th, early 19th century that had a range of just 50 to 70 yards. In other words, I would be able to shoot you in the back row and see the color of your eyes. With a breech-loading rifle, you could be further away, and there's a chance that I might miss. Small, but a chance. The machine gun is something completely different. Invented by an American because we're so good with guns. It was used first by the British in the colonial wars in southern Africa during the 1870s. And machine guns got faster and more effective. They could launch 600 rounds a minute at a range of about 4,000 yards by the outbreak of the First World War. There were 1,000 machine guns in operation in 1914. There were almost 40,000 in operation by the end of the war. And they were produced at the very heart of the armaments factories in at Birmingham and London. There are also, of course, a whole series of other technologies like flamethrowers and the use of mustard gas, which came out of the chemical industries that had developed from the 1880s. Well, I don't have time to talk about that. There are also the big artillery guns. Guns of up to 16 inches in diameter, launching enormous missiles in huge barrages, basically designed to prepare the way for infantry attacks. There were also the first early tanks. Tanks that didn't have great artillery weapons, but tanks that often were loaded with machine guns. And again, rather like aeroplanes that begin to be used on the Western Front by the end of the war, tanks are something that just begin to start in the First World War and really obviously come to fruition in the Second World War. The vast amount of transportation in the Great War was still basically done by horses. It was horses that dragged up these huge artillery guns to the front lines. Any of you that know that famous war memorial in the Kilburn Tube Station in North London know that it's a memorial there to the almost 500,000 horses, camels and bullocks that were killed during the course of the First World War. Only the British would create a memorial to the animals slaughtered in the conduct of war. But it wasn't just animals, of course. There were vast numbers of humans who also perished. And it became evident very quickly that the war on the Western Front would be one characterized by mud and immobility, not by adventurous forays running around with heroic movement. The Battle of Somme became, in a way, the characteristic example of this carnage. On a single day, on the 1st of July 1916, 60,000 people were wounded and 20,000 people died. On a single day. It's like obliterating the entire undergraduate population of the University of California, Berkeley, in a single day. By November, a few months later, 420,000 Britons, 195,000 French, and 650,000 Germans had died. If you add all of that up, of course, it's over 1 million people perished at the Battle of Somme. And this is what the killing fields of the Battle of Somme look like. This still comes from a very famous film footage of that battle. Let me try and bring this down to some type of human scale by talking about my grandfather. He was christened William Ralph Ellis, as many middle-class young men were given three names back in the day. He was born in 1898, came from a very respectable middle-class family. They lived basically at Heathrow. He used to grow up on fields that became part of Heathrow Airport. He was sent to private school, as respectable middle-class men were in the late 19th century, and at school joined the Officer Training Corps, which of course was a central component of private schools and part of this militaristic culture of that Edwardian period. His friends nicknamed him Jim, not because he had three initials and it was too complicated to say, but because there was a very famous Irish trade union and socialist named Jim Larkin. So, for a respectable middle-class boy who basically always voted Conservative, and you'll see he becomes during the general strike in 1926, he signs up to defend the forces of law and order. It was quite an insult to be named after an Irish trade union and socialist. He signs up at 18 to go to France. And he's part of this third battle at Ypres in the late summer and fall of 1917. This was going to be yet again one of these other final offensives where Britain was finally going to be able to break through the German lines. It was, of course, utterly unsuccessful and led to over 500,000 casualties, again, in just a few months. Now, his parents were immensely proud of this young man, as you can tell from this photo, and they kept a journal of his war record. His father basically printed up this journal and kept a record of all of his postcodes home and his letters. And I want to just read you out two extracts here. The first is from a postcard home that he sent in the middle of August. This is what is written in the journal. On August the 16th, we got news, scanty though it was, a field service postcard saying he was well, and 2 days later, a letter came saying, just come out of a most wonderful stunt, untouched. Okay, so one of the key characteristics of letters home from the front was that these young men, okay, your age, sometimes younger, in fact, almost invariably younger, had to try and reassure the people that they left behind, that they were okay. Okay? The reality was something very, very different. I knew this man in the 1960s and the 1970s, and he died in the early 1980s. When I was a boy and went to go and stay with him, every night of his life that I can remember that I stayed in his house, he would wake up having nightmares, screaming in the middle of the night. And because he was gassed, it sounded as though it was the screams of a dying man. Needless to say, he didn't sleep in the same bedroom as my grandmother, who fancied a quiet night's sleep. 55 years after, in the middle of the 1970s, at the end of the 1970s, he decides that he wants to tell the true story of the war to someone. And he dictates this account of that very wonderful stunt that he emerged out of untouched to my mother. And this is what he says 55 years later. Led up the battery of A Company, leading B Company on the left, C on the right, D in reserve behind West Hook Ridge. Shelled all night, but mainly directed at support trenches and communications to rear. Assembly trenches full of dead and in a terrible state of confusion with the outgoing battery, who had suffered very heavy casualties and achieved nothing during their previous attack. We went over at dawn, supported by a 1,000-gun barrage, subjected to heavy machine gun fire from pillboxes and concrete forts in Glencorse Wood. Within a few minutes, I'd lost all the men in my platoon, and as they fell, they slid into a swamp about 3 foot deep of mud and water. With my only contact, Platoon Sergeant Mills, we drifted to the left to avoid the swamp, and I picked up a few survivors on the company on the left and some men from the next division. Tried to make a defence position in a massive waterlogged shell holes. Waited to see what happened on the left and the right. Late afternoon, the Germans seemed to be assembling in small parties to counterattack us. They must have been spotted, and our artillery put down a wonderfully effective barrage in front of us. We could do nothing. Rifles and my revolver were out of action by continuous slides into thick mud and barbed wire. I had to cut off my puttees and trousers to free myself. 2 Jerrys, that's Germans, made for me with their bayonets fixed, but thank goodness they both got a fine burst of shrapnel, which finished them and saved myself and the sergeant plus 1 or 2 of the wounded with us. Basically, he spends the whole night out in this swamp of mud, and the next morning manages to crawl back back behind the lines. And he concludes, I led out 108 ORs and found that I was the senior sub with 6 other junior subs, all that was left of the officers. We went in 19 officers and 700 regular soldiers. We came out with 7 officers and 108 regulars. And then they were, as companies often were, at the end of those type of offensive, taken back behind the lines for a couple of weeks. The point here is that this is a man who was haunted by this experience 50, 60 years later. And yet, for his parents, he was a hero who'd survived a wonderful stunt. In fact, he went on surviving that wonderful stunt for the rest of his adult life, like so many of the other men that he fought alongside. So, far from becoming imperial heroes, as many British men thought when they volunteered to fight, the experience was one of emasculation, often, or of not being able to live up to the standards that were expected of them, may be a kinder way of putting it. The remarkable thing here is that there was very little desertion in the British Army, much less than in the French and German armies. There were something like 50,000 court-martials, 3,000 death sentences for people trying to desert. 346 of them were shot. And about 10 years ago, there was actually an official apology released by the British government recognizing that many of the people shot for desertion had actually been suffering from shell shock. And indeed, these men often returned to Britain crippled and broken. 2 million wounded soldiers returned. 400,000 of them went on disability benefits after 1918. And indeed, a whole new government department is set up to try and calculate what type of benefits people should get for having lost a leg as opposed to an arm, as opposed to a testicle, as opposed to an eye, as opposed to a half a face. There was a government department that literally tried to calculate what each organ was worth. And of course, this was the war in which shell shock was discovered. 80,000 cases in the British military, 80,000 cases that basically provided the occasion for the first very gradual and halting acceptance of Freudian psychoanalytic techniques in the medical profession. Most famously, of course, by the war poets, people like Wilfred Owen, who were taken up to this famous prison called Craiglehart up in Scotland to be fixed up through psychoanalytic treatment. Many others were subjected to all sorts of, electroconvulsive therapies and a whole variety of ways in which shell shock was treated. But importantly, it was also the occasion for the beginning of therapeutic methods. I'm going to play you very quickly Wilfred Owen's, the famous war poet Wilfred Owen, poem Anthem for a Doomed Youth, which was written in the fall of 1917 when he was actually a patient up at the Craigle Lockhart Hospital in Edinburgh. And my apologies for the fact that it's Kenneth Branagh doing the reading.
Anthem for Doomed Youth. What passing bells for these who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns, only the stuttering rifle's rapid rattle can patter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries now for them, no prayers nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells, and bugles calling for them from sad shires. What candles may be held to speed them all? Not in the hands of boys, but in their eyes shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. The pallor of girls' brows shall be their pall, their flowers the tenderness of patient minds, and each slow dusk a drawing down of blinds.
Okay, so I have about 20 minutes or so to get through this last section. So, out of the human experience of the war, what I'm trying to suggest to you is that the war really punctured this confidence and that had characterized the idea of the late Victorian Edwardian male and their role in the national and imperial endeavor. Now what I'm going to talk about is basically how the conditions of total war also decisively checked the key characteristics of liberal political economy and government that had developed in the 19th century. And I'm going to do this under three headings. I'm going to talk about what happens to the economy, the war economy. I'm going to talk about the introduction of conscription, and I'm going to talk about the management of the dead, all of which is designed to show you that the state basically takes center stage. Now, you'll remember, if you don't remember this by now, just throw up your hands in defeat for the midterm. Three central tenets of liberal political economy that I've been talking to you about for the past month. The gold standard, free trade, cheap government. All of these things come to an end with the outbreak of the First World War. Britain comes off the gold standard, it's suspended. Free trade is clearly impossible in the conditions of total war, and cheap government is not a way to develop a war effort. Instead, the state was required to get involved into all areas of economic and social and political life in ways that had been unimaginable just months previously. And it does so primarily through this thing known as DORA, the Defense of the Realm Act, gave the state unprecedented emergency powers for the conduct of war. So, for instance, under DORA, the state assumed total control of the railway system, all forms of transportation. It takes over armaments production, and it takes over control of the purchasing of raw materials and food. It launches an unbelievable war machine. All of the techniques of the Industrial Revolution were put to producing the materials for the war effort. So you see the size of the British military that grows between 1914 to 1918 in terms of the size of the army, up to 2.5 million men, numbers of lorries, cars, the big artillery guns that you saw, and even of aeroplanes. This is a massive industrial effort, and it is headed by a new government department known as the Ministry of Munitions, which was formed in May 1915 and headed up by David Lloyd George. David Lloyd George, who had been the key architect of the new liberal revolution and the people's budget and the introduction of old age pensions and national insurance between 1909 and 1911. By 1920, the Ministry of Munitions employed 20,000 people. That was the size of the entire civil service of all government employees a century earlier in one ministry. By 1918, 60% of the workforce, of Britain's workforce, was engaged in the war effort, including the large numbers of women in unprecedented numbers. 700,000 women working in the munitions industries, the famous munitionettes, but also another 840,000 women engaged in the non-industrial sectors. What this new control of the war economy meant was that the government, the state, had to find new ways of making workers happy and productive. Okay? The state began to recognize that in order for the war effort to succeed, they had to make workers more productive and more contented. This is in many ways in Britain the beginning of welfare capitalism, the attempt of industrial capitalism to take the welfare of its workers enormously seriously. Compare this, for instance, to the style of management, of scientific management, that came out of the United States in the same era. By 1917, the Ministry of Munitions had developed a whole welfare system. It had welfare supervisors that looked after, that checked the conditions of workers. It provided housing and hostels for many of its workers, particularly women. Women were put up in hostels. And in order to look after the moral purity of women living away from home or out of domestic service, they set up for the first time a women's police force in order to be able to more effectively police the population of women workers. They also did something, again, pretty unprecedented, which was take responsibility for the feeding of workers and setting up canteens and public restaurants where workers could eat cheaply. So, if the state takes a central place in terms of a command war economy, what it also does is take over control of the area of consumption to an unprecedented extent. Okay? So the state is involved in production in ways it never had been involved in before. Now it's also getting involved in the realm of consumption. And the best example there is food rationing. Okay, now remember that Britain had become a country at this point largely dependent upon food imports. This was the liberal free trade regime of cheap food. The problem was that the Germans led an incredibly successful U-boat campaign, submarine campaign, to sink the merchant ships that crossed the Atlantic to try and bring that cheap food in from the US and Canada and Argentina. So, prices, as the supply of food went down, prices escalated, and there was a great deal of public unrest about the length of lines, of queues, and escalating prices. And indeed, a whole series of strikes, of industrial strikes, break out in 1916, in large part about escalating costs of food and the inadequacy of wages to cover them. The state tries to introduce a system of voluntary rationing. It says to people, look, we haven't got that much food, everybody has to eat less, act responsibly and we'll get out of this mess. It's a complete disaster. Hoarding takes places, there's utter inequity in terms of who gets food and who doesn't. So by January 1917, the British government does something that it had tried very hard not to do, which was to introduce food rationing for the first time. So by January 1917, the state has complete control of this war economy, of production, of consumption, and of distribution. So that's the war economy. Now, conscription. If part of the central tenets of this liberal political economy was that the state wasn't actively engaged in economic life, that the market would provide its own methods of regulating production and consumption and distribution. So an actual central shibboleth of that liberal order was that the state couldn't tell people what to do. Okay? Now we know that this is a fiction, that people were put into workhouses, that they were put into lunatic asylums, that children were sent to compulsory school. We know that throughout the 19th century, the state, far from being small government, was actually often about big government. Nonetheless, the hostility to the idea of the standing army and of the state being able to tell people that it had to fight on its behalf remained incredibly strong. A leftover, if you like, of the conflicts of the 18th century in many ways. So it was important that the British army was considered to be a volunteer army, that people would volunteer to fight. But the scale of the casualties on the Western Front meant that they very quickly were running out of a supply of men. So in January 1916, hugely controversially, the state introduces conscription for the very first time. All men aged between 18 and 41, all of you men, would have been compelled to fight. And by April 1918, the age range is extended to 18 to 51, and critically, because conscription had not been introduced in Ireland, remember which had where the rising had been going on in 1916 at precisely this point, conscription was finally introduced in Ireland as well. Now the opposition to this was immense. And it came not just from socialist members of the Independent Labour Party, the ILP, were pacifists and were opposed to the entire war effort. They obviously were opposed. It came from the Manchester Guardian, the newspaper most associated with the Liberal Party. And it came from this organisation known as the No Conscription Fellowship. And they're important because they become the mouthpiece for those people who became, after the introduction of conscription, conscientious objectors. People who conscientiously objected to joining the war effort. 16,000 Britons. Again, the point that I want you to get here is just as there's very little desertion in the British Army, so the numbers of people who actually choose not to fight are very, very small. But nonetheless, 16,000 people refuse to fight. About 3,500 of them are happy to support the war effort in non-combatant roles, often, doing medical work on the front line, or transportation, or clerical work. Of those 16,000, about 6,000 are imprisoned for refusing all forms of support for the war effort, and many of them, as you can see in the reading from this week, are subjected to quite harsh treatment in prison. Many of them then go on to hunger strike in protest about the conditions that they face in prison. Being a conscientious objector in jail during the First World War is a little like being a paedophile in jail in 21st century California. It's not a category of offence that you want to be surrounded by other inmates with. Critically, those conscientious objectors lose the vote in 1918. They're the one category of people for whom the vote is actively removed in the Representation of the People's Act. Remember, 1918 is the moment when all men and quite a lot of women, all women over 30 and some in other classes as well, get the vote. The only people who don't get the vote in this new democratic system is conscientious objectors. They're actively punished for their refusal to fight. Their citizenship is removed from them. The other key role that the state does in terms of its development of the security systems and the handling of security risks was the internment of enemy aliens. Again, this had never happened in Britain until this point. Well, actually, there had been some of it in the Napoleonic Wars, but this is a totally different scale. The Aliens Restriction Act is introduced in 1914, and by May 1915, the German population in Britain, or German men, are interned. 30,000 German men were interned in May 1915, and their women and children were deported back to Germany. The German population in Britain effectively is halved during the course of the First World War, and people like my family changed their name out of fear of anti-German reprisals. Okay? My name is actually not Vernon, but Vernum, okay? Which for some bizarre reason, my great-grandfather thought sounded a little too German Jewish. So they changed the name to Vernon to make sure that their paper shop was not attacked by anti-German rioters in the East End of London where they lived. And finally, now, there can be few more intimate ways of thinking about the relationship between the state and its subjects to how it is that death is handled. Death is an incredibly personal, intimate experience for families. And yet, the way in which the casualties of the First World War were treated was profoundly new. Part of the problem was an administrative one, okay? There's a shitload of dead bodies scattered all over the world, okay? And the issue is, how on earth do we deal with this scale of carnage, this scale of mortality? It had once been the case that if you had some money, especially if you were aristocratic and you had a family mausoleum on the estate, you simply paid to get your young boy shipped home and buried in the family mausoleum. Okay? And that was an important part of making families whole in this type of thing. During the Crimean War in the 1850s, and I'm ripping all of this off shamelessly from a brilliant graduate student here, a PhD written here by by Andrew Keating that you can read if you get it through JSTOR, not JSTOR. Anyway, I'll figure that one out by the end of the lecture when my senility will have corrected itself. During the Crimean War, basically, they begin to develop graves in situ for fallen soldiers and begin to do a fair amount of romanticization of what it meant to have fallen and died on foreign soil. Okay? But still, there's an enormous inequity of the delivery of death. Some people got graves, some people got mass graves, some people, were still able to be brought home, and et cetera, et cetera. Well, the state begins to take an increasingly active role in this with the creation of this new organization called the Imperial War Graves Commission in 1917. And basically what it does is allow the state to take control of dead bodies. The state basically says, look to families, look, I know he's your son, but we have control of his body. You are not in charge of it. We're going to decide where he's buried and how he's buried. And what they do is try and democratize death. They try and create a form of commemoration in which each death is given an equal value. A uniform pattern of burial and commemoration. And this uniformity of style that they begin to they get hugely interested in, what is the cross, what is the memorial tomb, how are we going to do this? This is an empire-wide project. This is true not just on the fields of Flanders here, but it's also true in Mesopotamia. It's true across the Western and Eastern fronts. There's remarkably little complaint about this development. 500 cemeteries are built across the British Empire, 400,000 headstones are produced, and 100,000 crosses. It was a good time to be in the death business. Well, every time's a good time to be in the death business, but this was truly a boom period. So, the dead aren't brought home, but they are memorialized at home. And across Britain, if you go anywhere in Britain, any small village, any town, it is scattered with war memorials that were created after the First World War. In a way, the most important is this one designed by Edwin Lutyens, which is the cenotaph at the centre of Whitehall. So remember that image I showed you of the development of Whitehall as the nerve centre of the new imperial state? This cenotaph, which represents all the fallen men, was put right bam in the centre of Whitehall to recognise the contribution these men had done to the defence of the imperial state. They produce it first as a temporary one, and then in 1920 it becomes the permanent version that still stands today, and a Remembrance Day ceremony is held there that you saw Harry Patch at the beginning of class at 11 a.m. on the 11th of November. 11/11/11. That is Memorial Day in Britain. Small towns produce their own memorials, okay? And they go from the incredibly fancy in my old hometown in Glossop. Did I tell you about the baker that always closes during Wakes Week? When I was talking to you about the restructuring of leisure, that baker was right there. So it goes from the incredibly fancy to the ornate to the much more regular, simple cross constructed here in Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk in 1921. The Imperial War Museum has catalogued over 60,000 war memorials across Britain, all of them raised by public subscription, all of them raised by local money. And all of them listing the people who died. The one in Glossop has 300 9 names of the people on these plaques. And then after that, in the Second World War, there's another plaque at the back. Okay. I'm on track to be able to talk to you about the midterm. So just give me a couple more minutes here. Okay, so the first and most obvious point that I've been trying to get across to you today is that this war truly was great. This was a war that was as profound a human experience as it's impossible to imagine. This makes Vietnam look like just a different order of experience for the scale of carnage and its effect on the national imagination. And I say that recognizing the profound importance of the Vietnam War. The other point that I'm trying to get across to you is to get you to think about how far this represents a crucial turning point in the various processes of change that I've been talking to you about all semester. Clearly, the First World War necessitated a complete restructuring of the liberal political economy that had been put in place during the 19th century. Okay? But the huge debate, and we're going to pick this up after the midterm, is the degree to which those things were simply temporarily suspended for the course of the war effort. In fact, as you're going to see, in the 1920s, there's a real attempt to try and re-establish that. Britain goes back onto the gold standard. It goes back to free trade. It even goes back to trying to instill cheap government. But it really doesn't take hold. And you're going to see part of the struggle of the 1920s and 1930s is Britain coming to terms with this. Okay? So the issue is how far the war was crucial to those developments, whether it caused it, whether it catalyzed it, or whether it did it enabled simply for the continuity of those things after the First World War. The other key thing I've been trying to get to you is think not just about this political and economic order, but also about, if you like, the cultural order, about how is it that romance of Britain's civilizing mission in the world, that important patriotism that was linked to the advance of the British Empire and its belief in liberty and freedom as it saw it, how far that imperial confidence was decisively cracked. And clearly one of the ways in which I've been trying to indicate that is by talking about the way in which masculinity, the experience of men, becomes decisively different as a consequence of this war. So the issue that we pick up next week when you're fresh from your blue books is how far what happens after the war is about the creation of a new world. The men who return from the front line don't want to come back to business as normal. They want to come back to a new type of system. And it's their attempt to try and create that system, and whether it fails or succeeds, which is where we're going to head next Tuesday.